Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to project my voice, and those of you in the back, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. So good to be back. So good to see so many familiar faces. I won't say old faces, because I now have to wear glasses all the time to see. I'm like blind officially. So we are going to do a couple things tonight. First of all, we're going to talk about some of the progress we've made. And many of you guys in this room, I am indebted eternally for the work that you've helped us move forward in terms of moving the goalposts forward in terms of prostate cancer care. The radiation trials that you guys have subscribed to or participated in have changed the way we manage patients with the disease today. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I've learned a lot. I've learned more from you than maybe the other way around. Everything you guys have told me is a gift, and it's a real pleasure to be here among friends and patients. On theme, we're going to talk about some cars. Tonight's theme is hypercars. And so I hope you boned up in your literature. See if I can make this work. I sit on ASCO, as the speaker mentioned, CCO, and Prostate Cancer Canada. And I also started a charity with one other person in this room called the Prostate Care Foundation. Okay, so let's go forward. So we're going to look at a bunch of stunning vehicles. That's really why we're here today. It's not about prostate care. It's about looking at some vehicles together, right? This is why we go to Brampton and stare at the hot cars. We are going to talk a little bit about clinical trials and the differences between clinical trial and clinical study. It's lost on a lot of people, including the people I work with, but just we're going to basically go through it and why you should not be scared to go on a clinical trial if someone approaches you about that. We're going to talk about some of the landmark trials that really have moved, as I said, those goalposts forward that have allowed us to stand higher. If we're, Isaac Newton said, if I've been able to see farther, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. So every time we do a trial and we figure out what that next level is or should be, that's our new normal. And then we build from there. And if we do the science right, we never fall down from that. We keep moving forward, and that's progress. And then we're going to talk about the future. We're going to talk about what might be coming down the pipe and how things might be different in the future. And I'll give you a little snapshot. Many of you guys have already tasted what that future tastes like, and I think that's stereotactic radiation. Okay, supercars. Lots of guys here love cars. Okay, when did the term supercar? So I know the speaker said we should wait till the end, but that's not how I do things here. You know that. So when was supercar first introduced into the lexicon? When do we first start talking about supercars? You can just yell at the answer. I know we're not a shy bunch here. 1910. Not bad, not bad. Okay, so we have, so 1918 was actually the first mention of the word supercar. It was the Ensign 6, which was an inline 6-point-liter engine. So it's like a 1 liter per cylinder. No one can actually find a picture. I don't think there's any real cars of the Ensign 6 actually around. But about a decade later, which is still many, many years ago, they referred to the Bentley 6, 1928 Bentley 6, as a supercar. So again, this was 200 horsepower. So back in the day, that was something. This is something, Model T kind of generation, Model M, and now the Bentley 6 coming along for motor cruising. It has the honor of winning the 1928 and 1929 24-hour of a Le Mans back-to-back championships, and was driven by a guy who started Bentley. So what are hypercars? So if supercars have been around for almost 100 years, what are supercars? So supercars are hyper-performing. They are hyper-sexy. They are hyper rare, and that's really a distinguishing factor from the previous two, and they're super expensive. Like we're talking millions of dollars per car. And hyper rare, some of these cars, only 7 to 10 of the cars are in production. So these are the best of the best. This is the pinnacle of what's out there today. And one of the articles I was reading suggests that it's always a moving target. What used to be a hypercar 20 years ago is actually not even as good as my car. So it's a constantly moving battle, and that's a good analogy for radiation today. The things that we do today will be considered draconian in about 5 or 10 years. You know, there was a time, who got 8 weeks of external radiation treatment here? Did anybody get the standard 8 weeks? Right. So my goal is to make sure that becomes obsolete. And at Sunnybrook, we very rarely offer 8 weeks of treatment. We've now moved to 4 weeks, and our goal is to move to 5, and then 2, and then ultimately a single treatment. Now, we may have to stop at 2, but 2 is a lot better than 39, right? And what if I can tell you the cure rate was better too? So McLaren F1, 1993, so this is now 25 years ago. This was considered a hypercar in its time. It was competing against the Ferrari 499 GTB and the Porsche Turbo at the time, but this one blew it out of the water. 618 horsepower from a 6.1 liter V12. Respectable top speed, 243 miles an hour. We're going to show you some of the hypercars from today, and they can't beat that. So this is a car that still rivals a lot of the cars on today, but no longer considered a hypercar. Okay, so our first test of the evening. Which is the fastest production car in terms of top speed? Okay, so first we get to name them. So what, does anyone know what A is? Oh, I'm going to have to stay in one place. What's that? That's not a McLaren, no. Okay, everyone knows what B is? What's B? A red car, yes, it's a red car. So the red one is a Tesla. And this is the new Tesla. This is the Tesla Roadster. This is, remember the old Roadster, the original one? This is the new one. I heard Koenigsegg. Number C was Koenigsegg. I heard that from the audience, right? Remember the model? You don't know, who knows? Yeah, I think that's what it's called. And of course the Bugatti. So who thinks A is the fastest car? Nobody. How about B? Couple. C. All right, good. D. Oh, mixed bag. So, bit of a trick question. The actual correct answer, verified top speed, is actually the Koenigsegg. 277.9 miles an hour. It was actually 284 one way down a road and 273 on the way back, averaging 277. The first one is actually called a Hennessy. It's a Hennessy Venom. And it has rumored, or they have stated, it's gone 301 miles an hour. I don't know if that's off the top of a cliff, but it wasn't verified, so it doesn't count in the Guinness Book of World Records. Bugatti Chiron is really paling in comparison at 251. I mean, you can hardly get to work at 251 anymore. And actually, it's really a trick question, but the Tesla Roadster is actually the fastest vehicle. Maybe not on Earth. I didn't say on Earth. I just said the world's fastest production vehicle. So when it launched in the SpaceX program, its speed relative to Earth as of last week was 7,000 miles an hour. But relative to Mars, because it's actually tangential, because it's now going directly at Mars, it's coming at Mars at 45,000 miles per hour. So I actually think Koenigsegg is the right answer there, but there's an answer for almost everybody. And the Bugatti is just a beautiful car. Okay, so the Koenigsegg. So this is pretty surprising. 5-liter V8 twin turbo. So that's not an outrageous size machine. 0 to 400 kilometers an hour, and then back to 0 in 36 seconds. That's pretty freaking incredible. Yeah, 1,380 brake horsepower. 1,280 newton meters of torque. No one talks in newton meters. Does anyone think in newton meters for torque? So everyone, I always put in brackets the foot pounds of torque, because we all think about foot pounds of torque because we're kind of half imperial and half metric. So this one's almost 1,000 foot pounds of torque, and again 288 miles an hour, or 278 miles an hour, for the paltry cost of 2.5 million. We could all just pitch in together, and we could probably afford the gas. Okay, so let's get back to why we came. So what is the difference between a clinical study and a clinical trial? So a clinical study is basically where we observe how people are doing, but usually using a standard approach. So it might be a retrospective review. In other words, we might look through a bunch of charts and see how people did. It may be a population-based study. So we all collect information. There's the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Studies, which collects all this electronic information about how people, the age of people with prostate cancer across the province, how they were treated, and how they did. Now, there's certain details that are missing in that database, but we can get a general picture of how many got surgery, for example, versus how many got radiation, how long people on average lived with those types of treatments. And the whole idea of clinical studies is it lets you generate the questions that you will then test in the context of a clinical trial. A lot of doctors will say, hey, I got a bunch of patients in my clinic, and the ones I know of did well, so I'm going to offer that to all my patients. And there's a risk with that because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. It's very easy to forget about the guy who did very badly and maybe left your practice, and then your practice looks really good because all the bad guys, or worse, they died. But you forgot about them, right? So because these guys aren't identified clinically and prospectively, you might not identify all of them. And the other part about a clinical trial, which I'll talk about, is there's lots of people looking over your shoulder. So when I'm actually proposing a clinical trial, I have to send it to an independent group of doctors who knew nothing about what I do. And they have to give it a rubber stamp and say, yes, that actually makes ethical sense to offer that treatment program to this group of guys. Whereas in a retrospective study, you can do whatever you want. So you can see how there's a lot more integrity in the second part. So clinical trials are research studies performed in people that are aimed at evaluating a medical, surgical, or behavioral intervention. So there's basically, so if we're looking to see whether a new drug works for cholesterol, for example, or high blood pressure, it will be tested in the context of a clinical trial. And often we will use the clinical trial to figure out both how that treatment works and also how, what kind of side effects are associated with that treatment, and more importantly, how the new treatment compares to an old treatment, and that's how we move forward. So if A is found to be better than B, and B is your standard, then B hopefully will follow on the wayside, and A becomes the new standard, and then we have to come up with a new A, for example. Now there's several phases, if you will, of these trials. So when we start, and this graph on the bottom right kind of gives you a bit of a picture. So in the first study, we call it first in man. So usually what happens is when we're thinking about a new treatment, it's tested on animals. And you might have an ethical problem with that, but generally speaking, people use a new technique when it's brand new. So that's a completely revolutionary type of treatment for prostate cancer, for example. And they'll say, well, let's try this on guinea pigs or dogs or something. They have these different models where they can grow prostate cancer in rats or mice or dogs or whatever, and then they can try and treat those animals with prostate cancer to see if it works. And if it does work, then they move on to the first in man study. People often say, well, I don't want to be a guinea pig. So I found this cute slide where this is guinea pig research. Guinea pigs doing a little research. And so probably a bit of a cautionary tale. So if someone asks you, would you like to participate in a clinical trial? A very fair question is, well, how many times have you done this before? And they have to tell you. If you're the first guy that this has ever been tried on, just maybe take a step back and just consider what might go wrong, because we don't always get it right the first time. For example, our stereotactic program, we have done over 450 guys, but we've been doing it over 12 years. So we kind of know how we're doing it. But there are centers across Canada and the US that have never done this before. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can put the wrong dose in the wrong place and cause a lot of problems. So if it's a very fair question. If you've never heard about this before, all of you guys are very good about Googling stuff. Google it. See how many patients have been done. I have guys who come to me and say, oh, I'm going to do focal laser ablation. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I said, well, how many have they done? So I did a little Google search. They've done 8. I'm like, why would, like, there are 25,000 men diagnosed every year in Canada, and almost 10 times that number in the States. And you're going to go into therapy that's been tried on 8 other people? Seriously? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying there's a lot of other choices out there before I would jump to the 8. Phase 1 is where this is usually in drug trials, but it's basically we're taking an intervention, and we're actually testing this on a group of people, usually a small group of people. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Yes, it's usually a small group of people, tens of people. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 people would be a common number. And we want to basically see how well tolerated it is. We want to make sure it doesn't harm people too much. And particularly this is in drugs. So they might have a new type of chemotherapy or a new type of immunotherapy. And it may not be that the drug is, they may not test it on the people they ultimately think it's going to work on. They test it on a whole bunch of people. And usually they test it on people who have no other options at that stage. For example, people with advanced prostate cancer, if they've gone through the abiraterone, the docetaxel, and the enzalutamide, and they get no other options left, they might say, you know what, I'm going to try this new guy because I don't have anything else other than morphine and a fast car, which is good. But if you're still interested in some new therapies, you might try alaparib, which is a PARP inhibitor. We found in a group in England that even if you tried up to 5 other treatments, a third of people still responded to this new drug. But it was only in this phase 1 trial that they found that it worked. Once we find it's reasonably well tolerated, we usually, as I mentioned, we usually sample a whole bunch of, if it's a cancer drug, for example, we usually sample a whole bunch of cancer patients. So we might do ovarian cancer and lung cancer and prostate cancer and kidney cancer and whatever. And we'll look at, well, maybe the kidney guys did really well in this drug. And so then we'll say, okay, well, let's take a closer look and do a phase 2 study on just the kidney guys, because that seemed to be where people had the best response to the treatment. So they focus the efforts in. And so this is really looking at how well, and it's usually an intermediate endpoint we're looking at, like, for example, how much does the tumor shrink down? If it's 10 centimeters when it starts, how many people get under, we usually say a 50% response rate. So how many people have that tumor go from 10 centimeters to 5 centimeters? And, if we got a proportion of patients more than 30%, we get really excited about that. If it's less than 5%, we're like, back to the drawing board. If phase 2 works, then we go on a phase 3 study. And phase 3 study is usually where we compare it against the standard. We take the new drug or the new treatment or the new radiation program, and we say, now we're going to test it against the current standards and see how it heads. So this is like the World Series or the Stanley Cup Finals. This is where we're going against the best to see who wins. And then most people don't talk very much about the phase 4, but I'm just putting it here for completeness sake, is after the drug or the treatment becomes standard of care, we might want to learn a little bit more about it. For example, how does it apply in the real world? Because the phase 3 studies are very, if any of you guys, and many of you guys have gone through clinical trials, we select patients very well. We really select the best of the best. We want to make sure you tolerate it well. We want to make sure you're not too sick. But once the drug or the radiation treatment or whatever we're talking about is approved, we then open up who we treat those, how many patients get that treatment. But if you're not as well as the guys in the study, maybe you don't do as well. And we want to see what's the real world experience of this drug or this radiation treatment, for example. Or maybe you want to see how cost effective it is. Or maybe we want to see what quality of life, if they didn't measure it in the study, we want to see what that's like. Okay, so I've bored you enough about clinical trials. But basically, it's the foundation of what we call evidence-based medicine. So these trials here, the randomized control trials and the cohort studies, which is phase 1 and phase 2, they all go into this pyramid where it's basically how confident we are that the conclusions of the study are actually correct. The smaller the study, and if it's retrospective in nature, you got to be pretty careful. 50% of the time, we're wrong. When we get into phase 1 and phase 2 studies, we're wrong maybe 10 to 20% of the time. Randomized control trials are wrong only about 5% of the time. They're designed to have a 5% failure rate, just the way the statistics are designed. We have multiple randomized control trials all showing the same thing. That gives us confidence that A is better than B. And then we should probably start doing more of A and let B die. That's the idea. And this is the guideline work that was referred to. So when we write clinical practice guidelines, either at ASCO or at Cancer Care Ontario, these are health policy guidelines that basically say this represents the standard of care, this represents high quality care. And so people now will look and say, are these patients getting high quality care? And they'll look to a guideline to see if they're getting the treatment that the guideline says. Okay, we're now going to start going through some of the landmark studies. And I think many of you guys are very experienced when it comes to this stuff, but especially for the people who are newly diagnosed, we're going to talk a little bit about risk. And we're going to divide it up into the risk of prostate cancer. And so so we're on the same page. When we talk about the risk of prostate cancer, there are three things that go into that determination. One is the PSA. Everyone kind of knows their PSA number. One is the Gleason score. And what's really confusing now is we now talk about grade group, which is a slightly different animal. It's based on the same thing. In other words, what the cancer looks like under the microscope. In other words, how aggressive it looks. If you see a guy with a big beard and he's got leather chaps on and driving a Harley, and he's got tattoos all over his arm, he might be a really nice guy. I have patients like this who are really nice guys, but you might be a little fearful if you saw this guy in an alley. He looks scary. So he might look like a Gleason 8 cancer. And the last thing is the T stage, which is when we examine you or when we do an MRI of your prostate. Can we feel a nodule or see a nodule? And if so, is it in the prostate, outside the prostate, or has it gone to adjacent organs? And that gives you a T score, T1, T2, T3, T4. And based on this table, if you have all low risk factors, so if you have no or a small nodule, if you're Gleason 6 and your PSA is under 10, you're low risk. If you have a nodule outside the prostate, what's T3 or T4, if you have Gleason 8 to 10 on any of your cores, or if your PSA is 20, if you have any one of those factors, you're high risk, and everybody else is kind of in between. And most people are in the in-between category. So the good and the bad about low-risk disease is people do great. People do great, no matter what we do. And so that's the good and the bad, because people do so well, it gets really confusing to pick which treatment or which management option is actually the best one for you, because no matter who you talk to, everyone's like, oh, you'll do well with surgery, or you'll do well with focal laser ablation, or and that's true. You'll do well if you have no treatment. So of course, any treatment you're going to do well as well. Finally, we've actually done a randomized control trial, which came out last year, which actually looked at watching people, active surveillance, versus standard radiation treatment. So like this guy who got 8 weeks of treatment, this was 7.5 weeks of radiation, 74 gray and 37 fractions. Or they got a radical prostatectomy, which is a surgical removal of the prostate. What we found from this study is the chance of dying of prostate cancer was indiscernible. Can anyone see any space between those lines? There's actually 3 colors in there. There's a red, a blue, and a dotted line. Can anyone see any space between those? There is no difference. Whereas these ones, you can see the difference. So the chance of dying of prostate cancer in the first 10 years, and these were patients who were mostly low risk, but about a third of patients were actually intermediate risk. And really no big difference between the treatment arms in terms of death. In terms of disease progression or the cancer coming back, surgery and radiation had an equally low risk of the cancer coming back compared to a watchful waiting group of patients. But the watchful waiting or the surveillance patients can be treated at progression and hopefully have their cancer be put behind them. Anyway, so this is now evidence we have that by watching patients, which is now the Canadian current standard of care as well as in the US, this has actually been confirmed in this trial. It was 20 years in the making. It was started in 1993 in terms of design, and I think they launched it in 1998. And it came out last year, year and a half ago. So this is part of the guidelines that we help write at Cancer Care Ontario, adopted by ASCO. Basically, we should watch out everybody with low-risk disease. And if you have small volume Gleason 7 disease, it might be a reasonable thing to watch those patients as well. At Sunnybrook, we've done a lot of work in active surveillance, as you guys have probably heard me talk about before. And one of my fellows, who's now in Pittsburgh, did an analysis of patients of low risk versus intermediate risk and looked at the chance of cancer spreading elsewhere in the body, which we don't want, right? We don't want the horse to get out of the barn. We don't want it running in the fields because that's when problems happen. The chance was significantly greater if you had intermediate risk disease that the cancer would spread elsewhere. The chance of being free of spread would be 5% if you were low risk out at 15 years versus 18% if you're intermediate risk disease. And this is the chance of dying of prostate cancer, 3% if you had low risk disease at 15 years versus 11%. So almost quadrupling the risk of death. So in my mind, if you have Gleason 7 disease, we should actually offer you some sort of treatment. What we're trying to do is come up with a treatment that will cure your cancer with the least amount of side effects. How do people with surgery do? In general, patients with intermediate risk disease have about a 40% chance that the cancer will come back out to 10 years. If you have high risk disease, it's closer to 50%, maybe 60%. How do we do for radiation? Pretty similar. So this is standard external beam radiotherapy. In this trial, we looked at 7 weeks versus 8 weeks of radiotherapy. And you can see that if you got this, so this is now, let me just back up for a second. So when we look at these curves, these are called Kaplan-Meier curves. This is the chance of being free of bad things happening to you when the curves start at the top, right? So everyone starts with no bad things happening. And over time, some people have some things happening to them, like their cancer coming back. This is PSA failure, these curves. And so over time, the curves will go down. I'm just pointing this out to you because we'll see a different kind of curve, which is this one, which is the chance of something happening to you, which is the opposite. So it's just an inverse. One is the chance of bad things or an event happening over time, and the other one is a group of people who are still without those things happening. Does that make sense? So for the first curve, you want to be closer to the top, and for these curves, you want to be closer to the bottom. So in this one, the chance of being cancer-free, if you get 7 weeks of radiotherapy, about 40% of patients had their cancer come back, which means about 57% of patients were cancer-free, and we gave you an extra week. Well, we dropped that by about half, so that's a good thing. So we're pretty close to surgery. So what happened in September 11th, 2001? Anyone know? Everyone remember? A couple airplanes flew. Everyone remember? JFK, and then 9/11, and there's a couple other seminary events, right? So it was a sad day. I still remember where I was that day. And I'm going to get a little political here for a second. There was 3,000 people killed that day, and yet every year in the US, twice that number get killed by guns. Twice that number. We were outraged with 9/11, and only now we're seeing some outrage from the gun lobbyists and NRA. But I think it was amazing, the million of people that showed March for Our Lives. I think things might change. Okay, but this is what happened at Sunnybrook. Does everyone recognize this guy? Dr. Morton, without gray hair, or with little gray hair. So on 9/11, 2001, Jared Morton was in the brachytherapy suite doing our first high-dose rate brachytherapy procedure. And I was down the hall in the review clinic watching the TV. But this was the start of our program, which is now internationally famous. And Jared has done a lot of the heavy lifting, and we're indebted to him forever for this work. And Sunnybrook is now the largest brachytherapy center in the world in terms of patient numbers. So there are two types of brachytherapy. One where we put a bunch of seeds into the prostate. Those seeds stay there forever, and they emanate a dose of radiation over about a 1-year period, depending on what's inside the little seed. That's called low dose rate. In fact, our first brachytherapy implant was done by Jared Morton 20 years ago, 2 months. So 20 years and 2 months ago was our first implant, January 1998. 2001 was our first HDR implant, so high dose rate brachytherapy. So the difference is we put these little catheters into the prostate through the same area, the patch of skin between the scrotum and the anus called the perineum. Those little tubes are hollow, and we put a radioactive seed into those tubes, treat the prostate, go on to the next tube, and when all the parts of the prostate have been treated, the seed is removed and the tubes are removed. So the patient does not have anything left in his body, and he's not radioactive, whereas patients are left with seeds in their body and a little bit of radioactivity for out to a year. But patients do much better. So again, if we look at patients, this is in the intermediate risk group of patients, going out now to 8 years, we're getting about 80 to 90% of patients who are free of cancer. So a little bit better than external beam and a little bit better than surgery. When we did a cross-Canada study comparing patients who had brachytherapy versus external beam, you can see large differences between those curves. Unlike the first study I showed you where you couldn't see any error or any whiteness, it's very hard to mistake any difference between those. So at 10 years, if you have a standard external beam approach, which is typically 6.5 weeks in this group of patients, only a third of patients were still controlled at 10 years, versus brachytherapy, it's about 90%. And this is for LDR brachytherapy, and we're seeing the same picture with HDR brachytherapy. So then we went on, those were phase 2 studies. So we went on to do the phase 3 studies that we talked about. And the most famous of which is a BC paper that we were also co-authors on. You can see Jared's name somewhere here, Jared right there. And so this was 600 patients with intermediate or high-risk prostate cancer. Mostly 2/3 of those patients were high risk. And you had to be a candidate for brachytherapy. Basically, we took patients and we gave them either 8 weeks of radiotherapy with a year of hormones, or we gave them a combination of LDR brachytherapy and external beam together. So a brachytherapy boost versus everything given externally. And what did we see? The same pattern again. So we verified that there's a big difference between those two groups. At 10 years, the chance of being cancer-free by the PSA definition was 83% if you got the brachytherapy boost. It was 55% if you just got external beam alone. Whoa, right? Surgeons don't believe this, but whoa. It wasn't the only study to show this. In fact, it was the third study to show this. 2 other randomized control trials, smaller albeit, also showed the same pattern, a benefit for the brachytherapy boost arm. Again, this is failure-free and this is the chance of recurrence. These ones were basically discarded or poo-pooed because the external beam dose was lower. And we had learned, as I showed you in the first study, that an extra week of radiotherapy decreased the chance of the cancer coming back. So people looked at this and they said, well, of course brachytherapy is better, is because you're comparing it against a weak apple, right? You're comparing it against a 1974 Pinto. So of course your car is going to be faster. And I said, but race it against today's Corvette and show me. So this trial was very important because it compared using modern doses of radiotherapy, what we're currently using as the standard of care, and it still beat the pants off of it. When we put all these 3 studies together, it basically shows that if you're to the left of the line in the middle, it shows that all 3 studies are consistent in terms of their approach, so we can be more confident that what we're saying is actually the right thing to do. And so, and I'll just skip forward a little bit. Let's go forward. So it became a standard of care as part of the ASCO and Cancer Care Ontario guideline. This came out last year in March, actually almost a year ago today. And so this now represented the new standard of care. Every patient with intermediate and high-risk disease as of last year should at least have a conversation or be considered for brachytherapy. And if they're not getting good care. That's how powerful this guideline is. So people often will think about and hear about surgery versus radiation and struggle with the decision, and many are told if you have radiation treatment, you can't do anything about it if the cancer comes back. Has anyone ever heard that before? Everybody? It's not true. So there's a great billboard years ago. I don't know, I haven't seen it for a long time. It was from the Globe and Mail. It says, it's not what you know, it's when you know it. So often people will just say, I'm not aware of any problems. So part of our challenge and work is to go out and explain things to groups like you guys, because you are meeting, especially the volunteers who are in the clinic, because men will trust other men who've gone through that path, have walked that line before. And so if we tell you some of this information, you can say, yeah, I'm pretty sure you can have surgery after radiation. It is more difficult, the complications are worse, but it's possible. If you're in the situation you need it, it's possible. So if you have external beam, you basically got 2 options. You can have surgery. So if you have external beam or brachy, you can have surgery afterwards. But what's kind of really cool, I'm thinking, or in my opinion, is that you could actually have radiation a second time. When I was going through, we were taught, give the highest dose that the body could possibly tolerate, and then you're done. And we've now shown that it's actually safe to give brachytherapy to the prostate if they've external beam. You can give the whole prostate a second full course of radiation treatment. And we can do it safely with almost no side effects. If you've had brachytherapy the first time, we're a little more judicious. So we only treat the part of the prostate where we see the cancer. We do an MRI. If it shows a nodule within 1/2 or 1/3 of the prostate, then we'll just treat that part. We'll leave the other parts that look unaffected because we don't want to add side effects to the whole prostate. So it is possible to do. How about high-risk disease? Same kind of conversation. Basically what we're seeing in terms of pattern of care is that the surgeons over time Remember I was saying active surveillance became a new standard of care, like the data became stronger and stronger, and we said for low risk patients you shouldn't have your prostate out. In the States, it was big business, huge business. $11 billion is spent in the States every year on prostate care. Not all of it with radical prostatectomies, a lot of it's drugs. But when guidelines started saying, you know what, you shouldn't take prostates out if you have low risk disease, there's really no demonstrable benefit and yet significant harms, then the surgeons needed something to do. So they started taking prostates out in patients with high risk disease. So you can see from 2004 to 2012, 25% of patients were getting surgery for high risk disease, and almost 50% were getting that in 2012. And at the same time, the radiation rates were going down. Now, how does surgery fare against brachytherapy for high risk disease? Again, in Quebec, 40% chance of being disease-free if you have surgery, 78% chance if we use the brachytherapy boost. Surgeons will sometimes say, well, the definition of failure is different because radiation, it's the lowest PSA plus 2.0. So you'll often hear me in clinic saying, if your PSA is below 2, it's normal. So the BC group, that trial that I showed you, went back and they put the surgical definition, the 0.2 definition. So in other words, both groups use the same definition. And you can see that it's a pretty close race, right? It's almost by a nose. Photo finish. No? Probably with external beam, it's pretty close. But with brachytherapy boost, I think we're getting, even with a surgical failure rate definition, we're getting better results. Okay. In terms of being free of metastasis or free of cancer spreading elsewhere in the body, we might be doing even a little bit better there. Again, this is observational data. This is clinical studies, not clinical research. So they went on to do a multi-institutional study, centers of excellence around the US, 11, I think this is 11 or 12 different centers, all the best names. This is like the March Madness of prostate care here. And they had 630 patients who had a prostatectomy, 734 patients who had external beam, and 440 patients who had brachytherapy boost. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Who won? Surgery?
The 436.
Okay, let's go to the so here it is. Again, we're not looking at PSA failures because we know there's differences in the failure rate if we're looking at spread of the cancer elsewhere in the body. If we're looking at distant metastasis or metastasis-free survival, chance of the cancer spreading elsewhere, 13% of the patients who had brachytherapy had their cancer spread elsewhere. If you had external beam or surgery, it was 43%. Or if you flip it around, 87% were free of metastasis versus 57% if you had surgery. In terms of dying or not dying of prostate cancer, 88% of patients were not dying of prostate cancer if you had brachytherapy versus 77%. So almost a 10% difference in the death rate from prostate cancer. And this is only at 10 years. Does anyone know what the average life expectancy of a guy diagnosed with prostate cancer is these days? 20 years. It's amazing. It's fantastic. It's become almost a chronic condition. But it's 20 years. So to see differences at 10 years, it's pretty incredible. As a rule of thumb, between 10 years and 15 years, you have to double the difference. And then you have to double it again between 15 and 20. Okay. So that difference of 11% could be 44% by 20 years. Okay, let's get back to the real reason we're here. Okay, can anyone name those cars? Everyone knows C. We talked about C. What are the other cars? This one's easy. What's the red one? Oh. Okay. Anyone else? Countach? It's Italian. What's that? Ferrari. La Ferrari. Hey, it's the Ferrari. Ferrari La Ferrari. They built the car. I don't know how you beat that. If they come up with a better car than this one, what's it going to be called? Due Ferrari. I don't know. Okay. This one? Koenigsegg. Hey, very good. This is the one-to-one We'll talk about the one-to-one in a moment. This one. You can't see it very well. There's actually like a shark fin that goes down the middle of this. It's close? Porsche was closer. What other manufacturer is close to Porsche? In German. Mercedes. AMG. That's an AMG. Okay. Which one's the most expensive? So Koenigsegg, B, Ferrari, LaFerrari, the Keurig, or the Mercedes? Okay, who thinks A? No one. B? Okay. C? Expensive car? Okay, D? Well, you guys are cautious, too cautious for me. Okay, it's actually D. $3.8 million for the base model. That's before we start customizing it for you. Sadly, you can't buy, this is the list price. You can't even buy these cars. All of these cars were sold out before they actually hit the street. Ferrari made 499 of those. Koenigsegg made 75. Bugatti, I can't even remember how many. They didn't make a lot. So again, this is the hypercar, the hyper rare. I think, in fairness, this is a prototype. It's coming out next year. It's not even this real, but this is what the price tag they think it's going to be. So even higher than the Chiron at 3.4 million Canadian dollars. Okay, so but it's like the world's most expensive golf cart. Like this isn't actually that impressive. Like 0 to 60 in less than 6 seconds. I can do that on my scooter, right? Like 1,000 brake horsepower. Like 1,000 brake horsepower. Like that's nothing. The other cars were at 1,300. The Koenigsegg was 1,386. Now it does have an 11,000 RPM red line. That's pretty impressive. But look at the top speed, 217. Corvettes can do way better than that. So it's going to be, now it's a 1.6 liter V6 with 4 electric motors. So it's one of these hybrid supercars. But I don't see how they're going to be able to launch. I mean, you got to be pretty dumb or really rich. Like I think it's really for guys who have all the other hypercars and they just want to say, I have all 5, right? That doesn't make sense to me. But we're not in sensible range. Like this is not things people do because it's logical, right? This is what you do when you have a 500-foot boat and you've got 20 feet to spare in the hull. Okay, let's talk about high dose per day radiation treatment. So the scientific term for that is called hypofractionation, or less treatments, less fractions. Radiation people call every visit that you have a fraction of radiotherapy. So hypofractionation just means less. Basically, we noticed that if you give higher doses per day, you can get the same bang for the buck, which was contrary to the way we were taught. So this was revolutionary when it came out in 2001. The first paper came out in 1999. Does anyone know who this is? Or this is a statue of? Achilles. Very good. What's famous about Achilles? Achilles heel, right. But why was the arrow in the heel important?
It was the weakest point.
Right, why?
Only
Right, why?
design for
No, his mother dipped him in the river. Which river? Which river? It was in Hades. It was in hell. The river Styx. So she changed the biology of Achilles by holding him, by doing something to him. And what I'm going to show you is that radiation treatment will actually make prostate cancer weaker by hitting it in the Achilles heel. So one of our smart colleagues, Stan Liu, I don't know if any of you guys are patients of Stan Liu, lovely, fantastic, brilliant guy, like just off the charts brilliant guy. So what he did is he created 2 different mouse models. One had a prostate cancer tumor in it that was resistant to standard radiation, and one was a prostate cancer that was resistant to the high dose per day radiation, or stereotactic radiotherapy. And he implanted it into the flanks of these 2 mice, and then he watched how the tumors grew over time. So these are both radioresistant cell lines. And what I'm going to show you is a curve of how those tumors grew over time compared to a mouse that had just a normal prostate cancer that wasn't radioresistant. So that should be growing slower. And so what we're seeing here is the green is the parental. That's the one that's the standard prostate cancer, the one that's not radio resistant. you could see that it starts at some like 10 cc or 10 cubic millimeter size, and over time it grows exponentially up to a point. The study purpose was when it got to 100 cubic millimeters, they would treat it with radiation treatment. So the green curve shows you the non-radioresistant cell growth curve, and then a response to radiotherapy. The conventional fraction radiotherapy was growing about the same speed, maybe a bit faster, but as one would expect, when we gave a pretty high dose of radiotherapy at this stage, didn't really touch it. But what was interesting is the stereotactic refractory tumor, look at its growth. Look how slowly it comes back. And then it doesn't even, the duration of this experiment, it doesn't even get to that point where we have to treat it. The other thing that's interesting about it is what is sinister about cancer? Two things. One is it's a cell that grows without stopping. But that in itself isn't necessarily bothersome if it stayed in one place. What's sinister about cancer is it spreads elsewhere in the body and starts attacking other organs or other parts of your body. It's not so much the local tumor that's the problem. It's when it spreads elsewhere that it causes the problem. And the way it does that is we think it actually interacts with the host cells and eats through, there's a foundation that every cell has that protects that cell, or basically just like a house. There's a foundation and the house is built on the foundation. Each cell sits on a foundation called the basement membrane. Below the basement membrane is actually the blood vessels where the tumors want to get to. But the basement membrane stops the tumors from getting through, but they eat through the basement membrane. They dig through. What Stan showed is that if you actually, in these two different cell lines, the ones that were resistant to the normal radiation treatment were able to dig through the hole, able to dig through the basement. But the ones that got the stereotactic radiotherapy couldn't, or weren't able to do it as much. So we're changing, so two things. Cells that are treated with high dose per day radiotherapy come back slower, and they come back in the original spot, not elsewhere. Huge, absolutely huge. So this is in mice. We've been curing mice for 30 years. Like I think we've eradicated mouse prostate cancer. We can like knock on wood. We're not worried about mouse prostate cancer anymore. So we really have to so how does this translate into humans? How does this translate into what we do for you guys? So people have heard or throw around different terms. You may have heard of SBRT, stereotactic body radiotherapy, or stereotactic ablative body radiotherapy, SABR versus SBRT. This is the tomato thing, right? So this is tomato and tomato. I guess this is the British. This is the American. So SABR is more of an American term. SBRT is more of a British term. So if you say SABR or you say SBRT, you're really talking about the same thing. So if you hear me flipping back and forth between them, I'm talking about the same type of treatment. High precision, high dose per day, very few fractions. Okay, Pagani. Has anyone heard of a car called Pagani? Yes. Okay, there's one of his latest cars called the Wyra. And then one I'm going to show you is called the Wyra BC. But what does Wyra mean? Is it the island where Pagani lives? Is it Pagani's first name? Is it the god of wind? Or is it the name of the Chinese company that owns Pagani? Anyone? It's actually the god of wind. The bonus round, everyone ready for it? What is Pagani's real first name? George. What kind of Italian name is that? Horatio Pagani. Okay, it doesn't project very well, but this is a beautiful piece of art. This is more art than car. The numbers are pretty impressive: 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds. It's a 6-liter V12 twin turbo, 800 respectable horsepower, but not compared to some of the other cars we've seen. Over 1,000 newton meters of torque, which is about 735 foot-pounds, so about like Ted's car. 235 miles an hour top speed, and actually pretty reasonably priced compared to some of the other ones. But if you just want to see a car like that looks like no other car, just Google the Wyra when you get home and look at the pictures. The interior, every part of that car is a work of art. I can't even show it, but the mirror here is just looking at the mirror is just like delicious. Anyways, gorgeous car. Gorgeous car. Okay, so let's talk about SABR for a little bit now that we've stopped drooling on Wyra. Oh, and by the way, the BC actually is the first guy who bought a Pagani. It was Benny Caiolo, who's a friend. That's why it's called BC. Useless trivia. That's what I'm going to fill you guys with useless trivia. River Styx, Benny Caiolo. Okay, Sabre. And Sabre, useless trivia. Let's talk about it. Okay, there's basically two different ways that we can give high-dose per day radiotherapy. There used to be there is a purpose-built machine that no one in Canada could afford, called the CyberKnife. And then this is the machine that we have in every radiotherapy department in every cancer center across the world. Standard linear accelerator. It spins around you as you lie on that table. And so this is a gantry-based, because it sits on an arm called a gantry. And this robotic guy will chase you around the room like Wall-E. Anyways, so CyberKnife was the first treatment series on the block. And then we came afterwards with this group, and I'll show you both series. So basically, the New York series was the largest series that's been published to date. And they use CyberKnife exclusively. So these doses won't mean much to you, but basically we're giving 5 treatments over 1 week. So instead of giving 34 or 37 or 39 treatments over 7 to 8 weeks, single week of treatment, 5 visits on the table, and you're done. How did people do? In the low-risk category, 95% of patients were disease-free at 8 years. And if you give a slightly higher dose, it was 94%. So basically, very, very good. Like we're seeing more like brachytherapy than we saw with external beam, correct? If you remember those curves. And if you look at the low-risk patients exclusively, the ones with the longest follow-up, out to 10 years, those numbers are holding true. It's not like all of the people that I talked to with our experience who did brachytherapy were like, oh, you just wait. Those cancers are going to come back, and they're going to come back bad. So we were waiting for something really bad to happen, but it didn't really happen. The cancer stayed under control, just like Stan Liu's little rodents would tell us. What about our experience? These are the trials that we've done at Sunnybrook involving Sabre. So there's about 17 of them so far, on top of the brachytherapy experiences that we've done. In our experience, again, we flipped that curve around. The chance of the cancer coming back at 8 years was only 5%. So very similar. The purpose-built, very expensive. This is the LaFerrari. The CyberKnife is the LaFerrari. We've got the Chevy Corvette version, but we can do just the same results. No disrespect to the Chevy Corvette. And again, this just got published by my fellow Yasser. And we've got follow-ups now out past 10 years. Recall, so at 8 years, 5% patients had their cancer come back. With standard radiation treatment, it was 23%. So a little bit better. And this was 9 weeks of this is 44 treatments over 9 weeks. And we chickened out. We gave the treatment once a week, as some of you guys will remember, but only 5 visits over those 5 weeks. The other thing I thought was really cool, remember the mouse we told you the cancer couldn't invade, couldn't spread elsewhere in the body? So unlike our other series where we see lots of patients who have their cancer come back, it shows up elsewhere when we look for it. Of the patients who had their cancer came back, there was 9 of them total. We're still watching 3 of them, so 6 were treated, but 4 of them had their cancer come back in the prostate. And we were able to do local treatment, including brachytherapy salvage, on those 4 guys. So only 2 of our 114 patients have actually gone on to hormone treatment. So that's pretty good. That's a step in the right direction. So it's consistent with what we saw with those rodents, with the tumors that were generated by Stan. So again, here we've got external beam, whether standard or Sabre, you can go brachytherapy or surgery. And again, brachytherapy can go surgery or focal brachytherapy. So we always have a plan B, no matter what. And I feel very confident that if I give them external beam radiotherapy with Sabre, I can salvage them with brachytherapy. So it's now a conversation, brachy now or brachy later. Other groups have shown very similar things. 97% of patients are free of disease at 5 years. A multi-institutional registry presented last month, again showing this is 1,600 patients. So we're not seeing something at Sunnybrook, or we're not making this stuff up at Sunnybrook. Everyone who's doing these studies properly is showing the same thing. So again, it leads us to more confidence that we're doing the right thing. So what comes after this? This is retrospective phase 2 work, phase 3, right? So phase 3 clinical trials, we're now comparing So one group in Sweden did 7 treatments of radiation, high dose per day or stereotactic, versus 8 weeks. And they showed that basically there was no difference in side effects out to about 4 years. So that's great. So we're not harming people anymore. Now what we want to find out is it just as effective? There was another study that we participated in called PACE. We fundraised $1 million through my charity, Prostate Cure Foundation, to support this study. And the great news is we finished ahead of schedule, which is almost unheard of for a clinical trial. 872 patients, the target was 856. We were the number 2 accruer in the world in terms of putting patients on this trial. So it'll be a couple years before they get the results to this, but we now have the data. The cake is in the oven, if you will, and we can now keep moving forward. So, and then there's another study in the US called HEAT that's asking that same question. And there's one other one I didn't put on also asking the same question. So within the 5 treatments, we can either give standard dose or we can give higher dose. We can give a dose that's more like the standard external beam, or we can give a dose that's more like brachytherapy. And we wanted to find out whether it made a difference. So we did 2 trials that looked at these different dose rates. And basically, this again just got published. The lower the PSA goes after treatment, the less likely it is that the cancer comes back. And what we're showing you here is that the red lines are the higher dose levels. So you can see the median and mean PSAs in the patients who got higher doses were much lower. Now this is a semi-log plot, but they're much lower than those who got the lower dose. Because basically it's like, the analogy I use, dose for radiotherapy is like bullets in a gun. So if you got 100 bad guys coming at you, and you got 100 bullets in your gun, if you're a really good shot, you might get them all, but you're probably going to leave a couple, and you're going to miss a few. But if you got the same 100 guys coming at you, and I give you 200 bullets, in other words, more dose, again, you might leave a few behind, but you're more likely to kill them all. So that's what radiation is. The higher the dose, the more photons or radiation packages we're firing into the cancer cells to disrupt their DNA. What we showed as well is that if your PSA, and the other thing that was really important in this study, first time as anyone has ever shown this, is if your PSA at 4 years is less than 0.4, nobody had their cancer come back. So people follow with me and they're like, it's been 6 years, is it gone yet, is it gone yet? So now we can actually say with confidence, if you're under 0.4 at 4 years, very, very good chance that this isn't coming back. Now, if it's not 0.4, it doesn't mean the end of the world, but it means that you might need some treatment down the road. But it's nice that the guys that are coming with me or following with me, if we're under 0.4, it's very reassuring. And you're much more likely to be at under 0.4 if you get the higher dose. It comes with more side effects, but we're working on new techniques to try and protect the normal tissues. So we can use MR-guided treatment. We can put a space gel that separates the space between the prostate and the rectum. We can use this device we invented at Sunnyberg called GU-Lock, which actually holds the man more securely when he's getting his radiation treatment, just by a few millimeters. But we showed that 1 extra millimeter in the wrong direction increases your side effects by 5-fold. So this is stuff we're taking an electron, we're accelerating it over 6 million volts, and we're putting it within a millimeter of where it needs to. And if we're wrong, we can cause some real harm. This buys me 2 millimeters of insurance. So it buys me 2 more millimeters of accuracy. So buys us the stuff we want. So we can either intensify the dose, or we can reduce the side effects, or we can do both. It's just a beautiful machine, the LaFerrari. It's a beautiful machine. But, only 1,000 horsepower. Like, what are we talking about here? 900 newton meters. I think that's actually 741. I miscalculated. But it's a bargain at 2.1 million, I think. What about Sabre for high risk? Basically, you can do it. The results aren't as good as we're seeing for brachytherapy. So 65% of people are controlled out at 7 years. Again, reminding ourselves that for brachytherapy, we should be at 80% in that range. We actually use a slightly different, so in that first program they talked about, the New York program, they just treated the prostate. They didn't treat the lymph nodes. We were the first group to show you could treat the lymph nodes at the same time. That was our Saturn protocol. Nobody had a severe side effect from the treatment. We did 30 patients that way. London tried to do the same thing, but they weren't as accurate. And they caused a lot more harm. They had to stop their trial early. We finished all 30 of our 30 patients. They had to stop halfway because of side effects, because too many patients were getting 40% of their patients had side effects. And the difference was only a few millimeters. So again, this is very important information.
Excuse me, is that the lymph node radiation you talk about that?
So this is the chance of having bleeding in the backside, grade 1 bleeding. So both of these programs treat the pelvis, all of the lymph nodes, and they give a higher dose to the prostate at the same time. And we both had the same dose to the pelvis and the same dose to the prostate, but we were more accurate in the way we delivered it to the prostate, because I think we had a little more, I think we learned, there's a few people who were sitting in this audience who probably helped me learn the hard way that millimeters do count. And so we were very tight on our protocol. So you can see we shifted the dose that went to the average part of the rectum was significantly lower. We got about 5 gray less to the average part of the rectum, and that's caused significant less side effects. The other part is, well, normally if you're firing bullets, you can fire through the whole prostate. You can take everything in that region and push the dose everywhere, but we're learning that the greater risk is where we see the cancer on MRI. And so we're saying, well, we can do a lower dose to the whole prostate, and then here's our money shot. Let's just put a few dirty bombs into this area. So when Osama bin Laden was hiding in the caves of Tora Bora, US Intel said, I think he's over there. So everything got bombed, but a few megatons got saved for that region where Intel told them Osama was hiding. They were wrong, actually, but he's actually in Pakistan. But the idea is we can actually paint the dose. We're kind of like sculptors now. We can actually just paint radiation dose. Because brachytherapy is the standard of care, we wanted to see if we could combine SABR and brachytherapy. Answer is yes, we can. And now what we're doing is we're going on to a randomized study where everyone will get 5 treatments of radiotherapy. Half of them will get an MR-guided boost with SABR, and the other one will get an MR-guided boost using brachytherapy. The McClinton, this is a gorgeous car. So does anyone know what P1 stands for? Pole 1, exactly. We got a racer in the audience. So this and the next car, I think if I got it's coming at the end. This is a gorgeous vehicle. If you haven't done this, just Google or YouTube McLaren versus LaFerrari versus the Porsche 918, and just watch these 3 cars. It's really art. MR-guided brachytherapy, we're moving fast here. Basically, we have the ability to focus the dose. We know where the radiation should go. We've been doing a lot more of it than usual. And we've now got this down to a single treatment. So we used to give it with external beam radiotherapy, and we used to do 2 treatments of radiotherapy. When Jared first started this program, we did 2 brachytherapy implants and 5 weeks of radiotherapy, and now we're down to a single outpatient 2-hour procedure. MR guided, 1 done. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. We're now doing this as part of a clinical trial. Jared's the PI on this, so the low dose rate brachytherapy. So all patients get a single treatment. This is the current king, the LDR brachytherapy. We're hoping that we can knock it off its pedestal with this new MR-guided HDR approach, and this will become the new standard of care. What's beautiful about it is it's better tolerated, and it's actually like half the price. So we actually save the system money, only 1 treatment. Okay. So let's go over the options. So if you're low risk, so P is the preferred treatment, or preferred option. So if you're low risk, active surveillance is our preferred treatment. If you're intermediate risk and in the better part, brachytherapy is the standard of care. SBRT on a clinical trial is reasonable. Surgery and external beam are options, but I think if you can't have brachytherapy or SBRT. Same with high intermediate risk and high risk patients. If you have cancer in the lymph nodes, it's still you can do surgery and remove those lymph nodes, or you can do external beam. There's more data coming out of here that's actually helpful. And if you have metastatic disease, if you're one of the 5% who has metastatic disease on presentation, chemotherapy and hormones are the standard of care, and we're asking the question of whether adding radiation treatment can help it. It looks like it does. And we'll go on to the Porsche. This is my favorite, the Porsche 918. 918 of these animals were produced. Twin electric V8 with mated to a 4.6 liter engine, 2.6 seconds, 0 to 60. Same as the Tesla Roadster, 1,280 newton meters of torque, so almost 1,000. Does anyone know the lateral G-force in this car? What would be a good turning G-force in a good car? 0.9?
1.5.
1.5. Would you agree with that? This is 2.0. And it's because the battery packs, like a Tesla, the battery packs are on the floor, which brings down the center of gravity. This thing apparently is literally like cornering on wheels. Please go watch a video of this. It will actually make your hair stand on end. So I went a little over my 1 hour. We're going to take a bit of a break, get some refreshments, get some cookies, get some water. If you guys have questions, you can just shout them out, or if you want to write them down if you're a little bit shy. And then we'll go through some questions together, and then we'll try and wrap up at about 9:15. Sound okay?